Hello everyone. Welcome to my second mini lecture on sexual consent. Today we'll be looking at some of the components of sexual consent and affirmative sexual consent that may seem simple on the surface, but are often difficult to put realistically into practice or understand in the context of a variety of sexual relationships. Now, this video assumes you already have a decent understanding of the definition of sexual consent. So if you need a refresher, or this is new material, I would encourage you to check out my first video before continuing with this one. Throughout this video, I will be addressing questions and concerns raised regarding consent. And while I certainly don't have all the answers, my hope is that you will walk away with a bit more insight and can work to understand what consent means to you and how you use consent in your own sexual relationship. The first topic that we will cover is that of alcohol and drugs and sex. Throughout my research and in my time as a peer sexual health educator at my university, questions and concerns over mixing alcohol with sex have been brought up fairly frequently. According to best estimates, half of all sexual assaults include alcohol consumption by either the victim, the perpetrator, or both. And alcohol is considered to be the most commonly used date rape drug because of its accessibility and its social acceptability. In other words, crimes and serious violations of people's rights can occur when people willingly or unwillingly mix large amounts of alcohol and sex. This, in combination with the fact that consent cannot legally or ethically exist if people are impaired or incapacitated by alcohol or drugs, or because they are asleep or unconscious, means that when people are under the influence to the point that they can't understand what is going on around them, and thus cannot legally give consent, any sexual activity is, by definition, sexual assault. One of the first problems to contend with is the definition of under the influence, or impaired. Unfortunately, there really is no clear definition. Unless you are carrying around a breathalyzer, it can be really hard to tell how intoxicated someone is, and the amount of alcohol needed to make someone tipsy or drunk changes person to person. So it is impossible to say something like after 3 drinks, a person cannot give consent. But just like buzzed driving has the potential to cause an accident, buzzed sex has the potential to lead to sexual assault because of alcohol's effect on the brain. So when we think about someone's ability to give consent after drinking, we need to be mindful of this fact overall. The second thing we need to examine is the reason behind mixing alcohol or drugs and sex in the first place. Alcohol is often used to manipulate people and make people less aware or less resistant to possibly unwanted sex, which is of course malicious and highly unethical. But many people use it as a way to relax or wind down. Others use it to bolster confidence. And in these situations, mixing 1 or 2 drinks with sex probably isn't much of a problem. The law really isn't saying that you can't drink at all. It just recognizes and deals with the fact that once people are impaired, sexual assault, whether intended or not, can more easily occur. Consequently, we can think about this law as just trying to protect people from becoming victims of sexual assault. Or if they do become victims of sexual assault while under the influence, this law theoretically helps them with conviction if they decide to take that case to court. Lastly, many would argue that the ability to give consent while under the influence should depend on the situation. For example, having sex at home while drunk with a long-time partner whom you have a good, trusting relationship with can be seen as very different than hooking up with a stranger or casual acquaintance after drinking. Both are technically non-consensual events under the law, but some people are still going to see the first example as acceptable because of the situation in which sex is occurring in. In response to all of these questions that I brought up about alcohol, oftentimes people might be told just not to mix sex and alcohol in the first place. While that might be something that some people decide is right for them, in a culture where we often equate drinking with fun, romance, dating, and hooking up, completely separating sex from alcohol may not be something that some people are prepared to do. Still, in light of the role alcohol can play in sexual assault and coercion, it seems best to be aware of your own limits and comfort level, and that you decide for yourself your own thoughts on the topic of mixing sex and alcohol. So the next thing we will look at is the idea that you have to give and get consent to every sexual activity, every time. To better understand why this is necessary, even for things like a kiss, let's look at a non-sex related example to better understand the basic concept. For every medical procedure or test you undergo, you have to give informed consent, usually by signing something. Medical practitioners cannot just assume that because you consented to something like the flu shot last year, that they don't have to ask again this year. This is because the pros and cons of the shot, the situation, the timing, how you were feeling that day, all have changed. It's the same thing, but a separate event in time. When we transpose this concept from consent to something like a medical procedure to consent to sex, the same reasoning applies. Namely, that you have to ask each time, and that saying yes once does not mean that you'll say yes again. If it helps, think about the baseball analogy. Each base, however you define them, is a separate act, and before you get to that base, you have to ask, receive, and give consent. But this can be hard because people often tend to think about sex as a progressive model, rather than sexual activity as being individual stages with their own pros and cons and need for separate affirmation of consent. The other problem here, then, is that people interpret this to mean that they have to stop and mechanically ask for consent, and that this interrupts the mood, or that is unnecessary because you just know that they are into it. But when you think about it, you know because you are reading all of those nonverbal cues within a context that informs you that they can be read as consent to sex. And secondly, no one is saying that you have to make a full-blown stop to ask for consent. There are many creative, sexy, and seamless ways to ensure someone is consenting and that they are fully engaged in whatever it is you are doing. However, there are some situational factors, which I briefly covered in my previous video, that research shows influences people's attitude toward the idea that you need to ask for consent every act, every time. First, people tend to judge the need for clear consent based on the perceived seriousness or eroticism of an activity. So, for example, people are much more likely to not ask for consent, they just tend to assume it's okay, when it comes to kissing or a hug, because these aren't culturally seen as very erotic or serious actions. They don't seem to have really negative consequences if we do them without asking for consent. On the opposite side, research shows that people almost always have to verbally get consent for anal sex. Oral sex is more up in the air, some people using primarily nonverbal cues, and others use mainly verbal cues. On top of that, research shows you are much more likely to seek clear, explicit consent to something with a person you don't have a lot of experience or trust with, as opposed to a long-term partner whom you are familiar with. This is because you really don't have any reference or previous experience from which to gauge their consent cues off of. In other words, you have to be more clear when giving consent and work more actively to ensure that someone is consenting when you're not familiar with them. All combined, it means that the length of a relationship, previous sexual activity with a specific person, and the activity itself determines people's feelings towards the need for getting clear, explicit consent from a partner, which again is a fundamental tenet of both sexual consent and affirmative sexual consent. So why the emphasis on clear, explicit consent? Remember that the goal of affirmative sexual consent is to prevent sexual assault by ensuring that all people are consenting to the sexual activity that is taking place. And it's much easier to tell if someone is consenting when they use clear, explicit body and/or verbal language to do so. That being said, research shows that people are pretty accurate readers of nonverbal body language and can describe behaviors that someone displays when they are either consenting or not consenting. So rather than worrying about mechanically saying yes every act, every time, I think this is really about actively ensuring rather than passively assuming that your partner is giving you a variety of positive consent signals that say yes, that you check in with them, and that you communicate your standards for consent so that everyone is on the same page. For example, if you want your partner to ask every time before kissing you or initiating for sexual activity, make that known so that no one feels hurt or like their consent has possibly been violated. The last thing we are going to consider today is the question of, is yes enough? At what point are we assured that consent exists? As we dive into this, remember that at its core, consent must always be freely and voluntarily given, never assumed, and always given in an affirming way. Otherwise, it is, by definition, not consent. Inherently, then, coercion, threats, violence, and anything else that makes people say yes or indicate consent when they don't want to invalidates consent. The problem is, according to research, coercion, which again includes repeatedly asking, begging, lying to someone, blackmailing them, questioning their sexuality, blocking their path, and purposefully getting someone drunk, is for many a normalized part of American sex culture. Lots of people use coercion to wear people down so that they do say yes, or think by offering them a drink they will be more likely to hook up with them. But if they are pushed into saying yes to begin with, even if they end up enjoying the sex in the end, can we really say that this is consensual? The next question that comes up has to do more specifically with the wording of affirmative sexual consent definitions, which are again typically found in university policies on sexual consent and sexual assault. The definition basically reaffirms the idea that people have to give their consent in a way that is clear and engaging. So silence, the lack of a no, or not stopping someone by itself does not imply consent. Yet research shows that the most commonly reported way of demonstrating consent is through passive behavior, by not resisting or not stopping someone. This doesn't mean that they are lying there with no involvement. It could be that someone leans back, smiles, just accepts the kiss. In fact, all of these are commonly used consent cues. It's just that these people aren't actively doing or saying anything to really explicitly show their consent. This is another example of how real-life execution of consent behaviors and the definition of ethical consent can be seen as in conflict with one another. And it's important to remember that even though research on college students tends to show men and women hold a common understanding of what nonverbal consent cues are, things like culture, experience, and gender have the potential to create different consent standards. So what might seem like clear consent to one person might not be read as clear consent by another. This just demonstrates the importance of communication and of active engagement, so that you are sure someone does mean yes. And if there's any doubt, take the steps necessary to make sure they are consenting. The next thing we will look at also comes from the definition of affirmative sexual consent. The definition usually includes words like enthusiastic and explicit. Essentially, it's looking for people to be actively engaged in the sex they actually want, and the definition thus pushes a very clear standard for ensuring consent. Yet again, research shows that real-life behavior does not always line up. First, people have sex for a wide variety of reasons, so it might not always be enthusiastic. Secondly, nonverbal consent cues, which are again rated as less clear, are again far more commonly used by both men and women. If people do verbalize consent, which is seen as more explicit, it's not usually in the specific word yes, which is okay. It might be in response to something like, should I get a condom? Or asking a partner or even telling a partner that they're going to do something and have that person react. As long as they are clearly consenting, saying yes in an enthusiastic manner doesn't seem to be the most important part, and some people might hold that misconception. Finally, the last thing people have to think about is the question being asked. What are you actually saying yes or giving your consent to? Do you 100% know what the other person means when they suggest hooking up? The definition of hooking up and even the definition of sex can be messy. So before you can give your consent, you have to make sure you're all on the same page. Otherwise, you cannot give informed consent because you might actually not know what you're consenting to, and you might end up in a situation that you don't want to be in. Overall, ensuring consent is continually present is not as simple as obtaining a yes, because even a verbal, straightforward yes may not mean that you have their consent. People have to know what they are giving their consent to, and it has to be 100% their choice. And it's important to remember that consent is never just a singular action. We give off multiple consent cues that are read together in context to demonstrate our consent to something. So in short, a single yes is not enough, but the point at which one person thinks consent exists might not be the same for another person. To quickly summarize, we have a very rational definition of sexual consent, but many components that come into play in the practical application have yet to be strictly defined, can be really subjective, and what constitutes a sufficient level of consent can change person to person. Also, much of what we define as sexual consent goes directly against the common sexual behavior of American college students, and by extension, the general population. For example, the situation, who we are having sex with, and the type of sexual activity tends to change our behavior and our expectations for consent. While these disconnects can sometimes make people question the need for or the effectiveness of clearly outlining what consent is and what it isn't, none of the questions I've brought up today remove the fact that people, in some shape or form, need to ensure that every act is consensual. In light of all these complications and unsureties, I feel that it is of utmost importance that we openly talk about our values and expectations for sex, so that all partners can be on the same page and can then work together to ensure a consensual sexual relationship. It's also important to remember that all people need to both give and receive consent. This is especially important because there is a misconception that initiating sex is the same thing as giving consent to sex, when in fact, they may not always be synonymous. And finally, as sexual and social beings, we have an obligation to look at the cultural norms and sexual stereotypes around us. For example, the normalized use of coercion, or the idea that if someone doesn't want sex, then they'll just say no. And then be mindful of how they impact our behavior and expectations for sex. By doing this, and by being actively involved in thinking about consent and how we use it, we can all work to create a culture that emphasizes consent and respect for other people as we go and engage in sexual relationships. I hope this video has inspired you to think a bit more deeply about how you use consent and define consent in your own relationship and in our culture more generally. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Thank you for taking the time to listen.